Kyle is a humanitarian aid worker for Save the Children. While his main office is in London, he spends a significant amount of time on the ground responding to emergency situations around the globe. His work has taken him to Nepal in the aftermath of the 2015 earthquake, and more recently to Bangladesh in response to the ongoing Rohingya refugee crisis. In his role as communications manager, Kyle is entrusted with telling the stories of people in need of the world's attention. I've often wondered what leads someone to work in the humanitarian field. There's a difference between working behind a desk all day in the comfort of your office versus spending time in the field where you witness both the best and the worst of humanity and are confronted with the reality of those you are trying to support. In a job like this, how do you sustain balance in your life when you're exposed to such trauma and intense pressure? I'm Yasmina Sakat, and you're listening to Not That Original, a podcast that brings you stories that may not be so different from your own. Kyle, tell me about yourself.
Tell you about myself, there's so much to tell you. I work at Save the Children International as Global Humanitarian Communications Manager. Here in London, UK, I grew up around Vancouver, actually, Canada, and Toronto is my adult Canadian home since before I came here.
How long have you been in London for?
Been in London 3 years now.
And what brought you to London?
It was work. I was working at the same organization back in Canada for 2 years. It was a mildly interesting role. This became a more interesting role, so I just made the leap to our international headquarters, and haven't really looked back.
Can you tell me where you work and what you do?
Yeah, so I work at Save the Children International as Global Humanitarian Communications Manager.
What does that mean?
That means I work with our emergency response team. So Save the Children does a whole number of programs. A lot of them are about half and half humanitarian and long-term development. So I work on the humanitarian side. That's new emergencies, natural disasters, conflict. So I work in our media and communications team around those issues, looking to profile the response, get the right information out to general public, but also staff around the organization. We're a big organization, so there's a constant need to supply fundraisers, media teams, CEOs, people who are out in the public and public facing with the right information.
So what are some examples of humanitarian crises you intervened in this year?
It's been a busy year in the humanitarian world. That's a shorthand way of saying that the world is getting worse and more dangerous for a lot of people. It started, I had two major projects, I suppose, this year. Earlier in the year, I was in Uganda for about a month at the point where the South Sudanese refugee population had reached about 1 million, and there was a big refugee funding summit in Kampala at the time. So we were there to really push our own agenda for refugee education at the time. That was a big sort of summertime piece of work that I did. And later in the year, I ended up working in Bangladesh for about a month, working on the Rohingya crisis.
That was a huge tragedy. What was your experience like on the ground?
It was really interesting and chaotic, and when you work in humanitarian, the pieces that you touch are almost always in the news, but this one in particular was really trying, both kind of emotionally as well, like the stories that you hear. And my job is to write down people's stories, essentially. We're there to launch fundraising appeals, to get leaders' attention, to bring sort of the human element into the media, which is often missed in sort of the greater geopolitics of the issue. But I was there in early days, and what that meant was I was the first person from Save the Children who arrived and was able to see what was going on. So I guess there's no word or sentence that describes what that is like, but it was absolute chaos at that point in time. It was just after the attacks of 25th of August in Myanmar, and up to 10, 15, 20,000 people were coming into Bangladesh per day. And the needs were just absolutely immense. And as an organization, we were moving very, very quickly to meet all of those needs. But that requires a lot of things. You got to move staff around. You've got to set up an office. You've got to basically set up a whole operation from scratch in as little time as you possibly can. And meanwhile, you're there to hear people's stories, and they're horrific. So that's what you take away from it.
Do the stories stay with you?
They do. It's almost the nice thing about the work to some extent is that I'm not a journalist, although I kind of play one in the field. When you're out there and you're sitting in people's huts and you're hearing their stories, you're getting down their details. The end goal here is to help fund this response, and that's what we're doing. We're supplying the information, the stories, the human content that allows other people to connect closely to the work that we do. And ultimately, we've had a lot of success in funding this. But yeah, their stories stick with me. But what sticks with me even more than that is them wanting to have their story told. There's no, you often, your instinct is to go into an interview and think, oh, this person is going to be, maybe awkward about telling their story, and maybe they're not going to tell me the full story, or they're worried about repercussions for them. But usually it's like, yes, please do absolutely anything you can, please and thank you, tell everything. And they're just so thankful that someone has come to listen to them, because they have lived their entire lives under persecution, and for them, this moment is just sort of the culmination of a lifelong existence, which has amounted to, what we now know is basically mass atrocities in Myanmar. So they're just so thankful, tearful even, that someone was there to listen, because they've never seen a foreigner before. And suddenly the world's attention is on them and their family. And, they I think, understand that it is actually helping us in some way do more.
It sounds like there's a huge responsibility and trust put in you.
I think there's a lot of trust put in the whole team, to be honest. I mean, you've got everyone in a field office who has some sort of specialty. Whether it's, we've got the toilet guy who knows all about toilets, and someone else who does water points, and someone else who knows about setting up mobile health clinics and what diphtheria looks like. The needs are just so great and immense, and they touch almost everyone who's arrived in Bangladesh, that you can't do one without the other. And the responsibility is on us to work with speed. And I think that's the thing. It's not, like, if you're a doctor in the West, if you're here in the UK, people come to your office. And of course you're doing good work, but the onus is almost completely opposite, right? Like, if you're in the field and there's a sudden emergency, now it's on you to reach as many people as you possibly can. And that's where the responsibility comes in. And I think that some people might feel pressured by that, but ultimately not really. I think we're it drives you to do more and to go faster.
You were saying that your experience in Bangladesh was very different than other places. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, the this particular crisis is very different compared to other similar situations. I have not personally worked, for example, on the Syria conflict, but many of my colleagues have, and have spent a lot of time in Lebanon and Jordan working in the refugee camps there. The difference with the Bangladesh refugee response is the simple fact that this is persecution, plain and simple. These are people who are largely illiterate. They're not allowed to go to school. If they do go to school, the only thing they're allowed to learn is Burmese. They can't even learn their own language, Rohingya. There's very little access to any services, any education, any healthcare, anything, and they are under the barrel of a gun of militias and military. The difference with Syria, and it's not to say that Syria is a better situation by any means, but colleagues who have spent a lot of time with Syrian refugees don't have someone to blame necessarily. It is a multifaceted conflict that they feel caught up in, and if they don't necessarily feel targeted in the same way that I think the Rohingya feel targeted, just for the simple fact that they are Rohingya, and so it is that story, which is very different, I think, than other conflict scenarios where people are just sort of caught up and they have to leave because of safety reasons. These people have to leave because they are forced off their land.
So I guess the discriminatory aspect of the situation brings out a different feeling?
It's a different feeling, and it is less hopeful, more helpless. Not to say that there's no hope and there's no help. There is. But, again, if you're speaking to a Syrian, often they will say, yeah, like one day when the conflict settled down, like I would like to go back and I would like to do the thing that I was doing before. I miss my house, I miss my neighborhood, I miss my family. These people will never say that, and haven't. They do not want to go back. They're not welcome back. They live in fear, even on the other side of the border. It's something that, it's a lifelong issue that they have faced, and it's just come to this point, and for them it is very difficult to recover from that kind of discrimination.
Have you ever been in danger on one of your missions?
I think that I haven't personally, really. There's always the element of danger, I suppose, right? You are going to unstable places, shall we call them. Uganda is a stable country, but you're also at the South Sudanese border, and from time to time there are militia activity that happens, or you could just get stuck somewhere. It's actually very easy. If it's raining, your car breaks down, you just have to plan ahead. And sometimes the greatest fear that you have is actually that road safety element, which is interesting. Most people don't think about that in terms of humanitarian work, but I think, I don't have the stat off the top of my head, but it's somewhere around 80% of humanitarian aid worker death is due to traffic and road safety.
Road accidents?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
It happens, and I think back to a couple different trips that I've done. I remember we're driving through the Ethiopian Somali region desert towards the Somaliland border on the north side, and there are no roads. Like, suddenly you're 2 hours away from the nearest building, really, just driving through brush, and anything could happen to you. So it's not, I never really felt danger necessarily, but it's isolated, right? Like, you're not necessarily where the action is always, and that in and of itself is kind of interesting. Although, on the danger side, I do have colleagues who have absolutely faced issues that I have not. Just recently, we had to move some staff out of our Yemen country office due to the conflict there. And, typically when we have to evacuate staff, any agency evacuating staff is precautionary. There was actual gunfights and grenade attacks in the street right outside the office, where people had to hole up in safe houses and for several nights to be sure that they were going to make the journey to the airport once it was finally opened. So that there is an element of that throughout the system.
So what was the first country you were deployed to?
The first country
The
that
first
I
crisis.
went, in my current role, so I've been here about 3 years now. The first one was actually Nepal, after the Nepal earthquake. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting now that I've spent some time in Bangladesh to think back to a natural disaster in Nepal, which is a very different feel than a conflict scenario. And yet much more visibly shocking, I guess. Mm-hmm. It's hard to get into the country in the first place. The airport wasn't functional entirely, and when you do land, you know, buildings are down, right? Like people are in the streets, like they're intense. They're out in the open for fear of aftershocks and other things. So like that crisis was very in your face. You know, as a first emergency, when you first arrived, you're like, "Whoa, what am I getting into here? This is crazy." But the spirit of people was very different, almost in a natural disaster. I mean, sure, 9,000 people died in that earthquake, but communities really come together. I don't know how to. Yeah, communities really do come together really quickly to help each other, and at that point, you feel a lot of. They're very resilient, and you're basically there to support their resilience. As opposed to, you know, you realize that you're not the answer. And I think that is actually quite helpful, right? When you arrive and you're like, okay, you know, you're not there to save the world necessarily. The systems and the structures and the people and the communities are in place to really help themselves. And, you know, you're just there to nudge a little bit further with a little bit of funding, with a little bit of, you know, help in the work that we do, get them on the right path.
After working for 3 years in your current role, what do you know today that you didn't know then?
I think that, yeah, you know, I don't think that I collect a lot of experiences in my role, not necessarily a lot of knowledge, but it might be that resilience aspect. I mean, I spoke about resilience in Nepal. That was 3 years ago. If you asked me 2.5 years ago about resilience, I don't know if I would quite understand it. But now that I've understood multiple different scenarios. I've worked on a drought. I've worked on a hunger crisis, an earthquake, you know, gang conflict in Central America, you know, mass atrocities against the Rohingya in Myanmar. What I am understanding is that humans across multiple hardships are really remarkably inspiring creatures. You know, what we can go through and recover from is beyond, I think, the knowledge that most of us have in the North or the West, because we just haven't really experienced those same things.
Experience the same type of struggle.
Yeah.
Do you need the hope to do what you do?
Hope. Yeah, I mean, the hope sort of comes from that understanding of how resilient people can be. So, you know, there is always hope, but you know, I almost, even though I don't even work in, for example, climate change, it's easy to like cut down your own hope sometimes and think, oh my goodness, you know, we do have a realm of expertise which is really helping people, but you know, what about tidal flooding when the ice caps melt, you know? And so you can almost always top your own hope with some other tragedy, and if your mind is sort of set to all the different risks that people can face, it can become a bit overwhelming.
Does it get overwhelming for you?
No, not really. I think there's moments where you can feel overwhelmed, but you just have to kind of know your place in the order of the universe in that point in time. You know, you're not there to fix everything, but you are there to do something, even a small piece. And I think the more that you contextualize yourself and think in the big picture, it really does help. But it's quite a psychological exercise that you have to go through, you know, to be mindful of your place in that whole structure, right? Mm-hmm. And then that sounds really meta, but you do, you know, when you get into your hotel after being out in the field for 14 hours or whatever, you just have to take some time and think, you're one person here. You did what you could today.
What led you down the path of humanitarian work?
It was an accident. And a happy one. You know, I graduated university in 2008. There were no jobs. Not that I knew what I wanted to do necessarily, but I took an internship in India, and I stayed there for the better part of a year, and eventually got hired at that NGO in communications. So both my experience with charity work and communications was accidental, and I have the Great Recession to thank for that. And like the first place that I worked, and other projects as well, were much more long-term development focused. We would build a school, hire teachers.
This is the India project?
Yeah, exactly. And it was all really good, but it wasn't. There's a rush that you get when you work in the humanitarian side, and suddenly you get a push notification on your phone that says there's an earthquake somewhere, and now you've got about 3 hours to do something, and it's very motivating. And it's very stressful. I have a lot of gray hairs that I didn't have a couple years ago. But at the end of the day, it's just, it is very personally satisfying. But it's not just about personal satisfaction. It's like just being part of a team, I guess. It's like, again, it's not about you doing it. But the other thing about humanitarian work, I would say, is that there's always a big group of us who work. We've got we've got hundreds of local staff who are already there, and they're going the mile. They're even donating their own money to the response. When I was in Bangladesh, all the local staff were chipped in whatever they could to buy rice, and we did a big sort of food distribution one day that was just out of their own pockets, and that
Wow.
like it's really inspiring.
Mm-hmm.
And you just feel part of something, I guess.
Part of something bigger.
Yeah.
That elusive sort of drive that.
Yeah, you never really get there. It's elusive. It's always elusive. But there's, glimpses of it, and it's those moments like that one, like the rice distribution where I thought, oh, like, people are great.
What do you find most interesting about your job?
What is really interesting about the role, and I mean, this is true of almost anyone's job to some extent, right? No matter what your job is, it's the element of surprise. You don't really know what your day to day is going to be like, but I really don't know what my day to day is like. 2 days before I ended up leaving on a plane to Nepal after the earthquake, I was in Berlin on holiday. And then I got a text message that said, hey, there's been an earthquake, can you go? And I just said yes, and I went. And it just takes your life in directions that you didn't necessarily expect. And that's sort of the big side of the element of surprise, but the micro one as well. I remember being in Bangladesh, and there was a long time that we couldn't do a lot of media interviews, just because the situation was so fluid and changing all the time, and we had to catch up basically to where the government of Myanmar was sitting and what they were saying about the response, and what the government of Bangladesh was saying about the response. And we're there to provide a service, right? And you have to take out yourself into context into those different political environments. So we're constantly negotiating what we can and can't say, whether in fundraising appeals, with media interviews, and so on. But there finally came a point where, okay, we're going to do media. And I did this, the first interview that came in, I was in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, and I got a phone call from CBC Radio in Toronto, and they said, can you go on the air in about 10 minutes? I said, sure, yeah, 10 minutes is fine. And I was in the lobby of my hotel. I ran up to my room, quickly went to the bathroom, and it wasn't 10 minutes. It was 2 minutes. And I did my first interview of that response from the toilet.
Did they know that?
They did absolutely not. Yeah, no, I don't think they knew it anyway. I mean, there was probably an echo behind me, and they're wondering, wow, what were the acoustics like in this
The acoustics must have been good
room,
in that case.
But so when I say you never really know what your day is going to be like,
Yeah.
we went from morning time that day saying, no, we're not going to do media today. We're not in a place where we're comfortable adjusting to the situation. We got to figure things out with the government. And next thing you know, you're sitting on the toilet doing radio interviews from Canada.
Do you see yourself doing this long term?
Yeah, I think so. I think I have the balance right for me. I mean, enjoy the work that I do. And I live in London. I travel about 25-30% of the year or so, but I do need that time to sort of be here, reflect, work a bit remotely before I'm out in the field as well. And so I feel comfortable with what I'm doing. So at least the short to medium term, you never know what crisis is next and if you might want to go another direction. But I'm happy now.
Are there any stories that really stick in your mind? Stories that refugees have shared with you, or people in disaster zones?
Refugees' stories are almost always harrowing, and they are shocking. If you work in a natural disaster, I mean, it's absolutely a personal tragedy. Someone lost their house, they lost their property, maybe, their livestock or their children or someone they were related to was injured or killed, and that's always sad. But when a refugee speaks about being driven from their home, it under those circumstances, it's kind of shocking. I mean, I spoke to this one person who told me in Bangladesh that she broke her arm. So it was in a cast, and because she had to run out of the house as the military had set it on fire. So she, they came into the house. They shot her one son point blank right in front of him, right in front of her. He died. She threw the other one out the window to save him, and then went after him as they were setting the house on fire. Broke her arm. It took her 13 days to go through the forest, only at nighttime to avoid detection, to get to Bangladesh. And that story is so common that it's not even one story that sticks with you. It's the fact that you're now in a camp with 500,000 people, a city that has sprung up out of nowhere, and almost everyone has experienced something like this or knows someone who has. So it is shocking. Just as resilient as we are as humans and helpful to one another, we're also absolutely horrible, cruel creatures. I mean, it's just so hard to imagine someone doing this to another person. And that was just the start of it, We did a report with some of the most graphic stories that we could find. Basically, just to give a picture of how institutionalized and regular the persecution was against these people. You're talking about child rape, babies being taken from their mother's arms and thrown into flames. Yeah, I mean, it sticks with you. On the flip side of that, I think sometimes some of the more inspiring stories and weird stories can come from staff. Like, I work with this one doctor who was in Bangladesh with me, and he told me this story about an earthquake in India. This was like 30 years ago, and he was with a small local organization, and he had to drive from the city where he was staying. I can't remember the name of it right now, but that's, he was on his way to the disaster zone, and saw on the way there was this man with a bear, and they were doing a street performance, and the bear was sort of like a domesticated bear of some kind. And this happens sometimes, like the bear is doing tricks, and it was playing for kids, and throwing balls in the air and that kind of thing. And he thought, oh my god, this is great, like I'm gonna take this man and this bear, and I'm gonna take him to the earthquake zone and entertain children, because they've just lost everything. Now they need some sort of entertainment. And he managed to convince the man to come with him, and paid him out of his own pocket. And next thing you know, he's got a driver. The bear is in the car, like sitting in the front seat of the car.
Oh my god!
Between him and the driver. And so they got to where they did, and this is not the kind of program that we would necessarily do today, for example, as a humanitarian organization, but it came from somewhere. Like the fact that you work with people who look at a bear who is juggling balls on the side of the road and think, I can use this for for a response and to help people in a time of need. It's
It's a pretty amazing story.
it's a great story, and it's weird and amusing, and
It's
I
so
feel
absurd.
it's absurd. I feel bad for the bear, but at the same time, like, you know, at least the bear's doing some good too.
Yeah. Well, what do you do with the? I mean, once you come back to London, how do you deal with the stories you've been hearing and the situations you've been experiencing?
I think when you come back, you know, everyone has an outlet to some degree. You know, I have a friend who's just really into gardening, and the first thing that she does when she comes home is like plant carrots, you know, and like that's the thing that sort of grounds you. You need space to think about what you have seen and what you've done. And I think that's all you really need. You just need to give the time and space that you think you need personally to deal with it. It's not like, you know, a set thing that you need to do or, you know, whatever. Like you just, what makes you happy? Like when I get back, you know, I have a dog, and she's a pug, and she's absolutely lovely, and I just love taking her around. Like, you know, for example, I go to the coffee shop, and they all know Stella as well, and there's just something about like taking the dog to the coffee shop and they haven't seen her for a month because I haven't been there, and suddenly there's like 6 people who are like, oh, Stella, I haven't seen you in so long, and it brings you joy, you know, and you just need to seek out the moments that make you happy, and but you also have to know what makes you happy too, right? I think that's part of being a healthy humanitarian. Get a dog is my answer.
Get a dog. Well, dogs are known to lift up spirits.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Kyle. Really appreciate
Thank you.
it. And what's your pitch for donating to Save the Children?
You can go to savethechildren.net if you want to know more about what we do, and find we've got a very, you know, comprehensive list of wherever you live, whether that's UK, US, Canada, Norway. Find your website there and see what you can do at home.
Thanks for listening to Not That Original. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and feel free to share this podcast.